The night Matthew Watkins walked into the Dusty Rose Saloon in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, he had not written a single word to another living soul in 7 years, and he had made a quiet, stubborn peace with that silence, right up until the moment he heard her laugh. It was the kind of laugh that did not belong in a place like the Dusty Rose. It was too clean for it, too warm, like sunlight breaking through the cracked planks of a barn roof and landing squarely on something that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Matthew was standing at the bar with his hat low and his whiskey untouched, which was his habit. He ordered drinks he never finished because a man nursing a glass drew fewer questions than a man with empty hands. He had ridden in from the Flint Hills that morning, trailing a small herd of cattle for a rancher named Beaumont who paid fairly and asked nothing personal, which suited Matthew just fine. He turned slowly, the way a man turns when he is trying not to appear interested, and he found her near the far end of the bar, a small woman in a calico dress that had clearly seen better days, the hem dusted with road grime and one of the sleeve buttons missing. She was talking to the bartender, a heavy-set man named Gerald who had the disposition of a boiled boot, and she was making him laugh despite himself. She had dark hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck, strands of it escaping around her face from the wind that blew through the swinging doors, and her eyes, even from across the room Matthew could see they were a particular shade of brown that reminded him of creek water in late October, deep and moving and full of things you could not quite see from the surface. She was arguing, he realized, politely, firmly, with a cheerfulness that seemed to unsettle Gerald considerably. She was holding a folded piece of paper and gesturing to it, and Gerald was shaking his head, and she was not backing down even a fraction. Matthew picked up his untouched whiskey, turned back to the bar, and stared at the amber liquid in the glass. He told himself it was none of his business. He told himself that approximately 4 more times over the course of the next minute and a half, and then he picked up his glass and walked to the far end of the bar. Up close, she was perhaps 23, 24 years old, with a straightforward face that was pretty without being delicate. There was something resolute in the set of her jaw, something that suggested she had made decisions and lived with them. She smelled of dust and horse and faintly of lavender soap, and she was, Matthew now heard clearly, trying to find a man named Calvin Briggs. "He left me a letter," she was saying to Gerald, her voice steady and patient as a schoolteacher's. "He said he would be in Caldwell by the first week of October. He described this saloon specifically. He said to ask for Gerald Morse at the Dusty Rose, and Gerald Morse would know where he was staying." "Lady," Gerald said for what sounded like the 4th or 5th time, "I don't know any Calvin Briggs." "He is my brother," she said. "He is 21 years old and he is not a drinking man, so perhaps he came here to meet someone rather than to drink. Perhaps he left word for me." Gerald spread his hands in a gesture of helpless finality. "I told you, ma'am, I don't know the man." Matthew set his glass down on the bar. He had not intended to speak. The words came out anyway. "Calvin Briggs from Wichita," he said. "Skinny fellow, red hair, wears a brown coat 2 sizes too big for him." The woman turned to look at him, and he discovered that her eyes, up close, had flecks of gold in them that the lamplight caught. She was studying him with a directness that most women in 1878 were trained out of early, and Matthew, who had spent 7 years making himself as unremarkable as possible, found himself standing a little straighter under the weight of her attention. "Yes," she said carefully. "Do you know him?" "Saw him 2 weeks ago in Wichita," Matthew said. "He was heading out to one of the homestead claims east of here. There was a land rush on the Cherokee Strip border. A lot of young men went east toward the Chikaskia River trying to stake something before the railroad got there. He mentioned he had a sister coming to meet him." Something in her face shifted, relief and worry arriving at the same moment and competing for the same ground. "He went east, he told me to come here. He said Caldwell. He may have sent the letter before the land rush started," Matthew said. "Things move fast out here." She looked at the letter in her hand, then back at him. "How far east?" "Depends which claim he went to. A day's ride, maybe 2." She folded the letter with precise, careful movements, tucking it into the small bag she carried over her shoulder. Then she extended her right hand to him with the easy confidence of a woman who had grown up shaking hands with farmhands and neighbors. "Birdie Hayes," she said. "From Abilene originally." He shook her hand. Her grip was firm. "Matthew Watkins. Do you know the territory east of here, Mr. Watkins? Well enough to find a homestead claim." He should have said he was heading the other direction. He should have said he had a job to get back to, which was true. Beaumont had more cattle to move in 3 weeks and expected Matthew back. He should have said any number of things. "Well enough," he said. Birdie Hayes looked at him for a long moment, measuring something she did not name aloud. Then she nodded. "I have a horse. I have $12.40 I can pay for a guide." "I don't need pay," Matthew said. "I'm not charity," she said immediately, and her chin went up a degree. "I know that," he said. "I didn't mean that. I just meant I know the territory. It's not a favor so much as it's a direction." Something in her expression softened slightly, not going tender but going honest. "All right," she said. "When can you ride?" "Morning's better," he said. "The road east gets soft after dark from the creek crossings." "We'll make better time at first light." She nodded. "I'll be at the livery at first light then." She picked up her bag, dropped a coin on the bar for the water she had apparently been drinking rather than anything stronger, and gave him another one of those direct looks. "I appreciate it, Mr. Watkins." Then she walked out of the saloon and the doors swung closed behind her, and Gerald the bartender leaned on the counter and looked at Matthew with the expression of a man watching another man step onto ice he is not sure will hold. "You know her?" Gerald asked. "No," Matthew said. "No Calvin Briggs." Briefly. Gerald shook his head slowly. "Well, good luck to you, son." Matthew finished his whiskey, which was something he almost never did. He went to the room he had rented above the general store down the street, a narrow room with a rope bed and a window that faced west. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off his boots and set them side by side on the floor with the automatic precision of a man who had learned to be ready to move quickly, which was something the war had given him that he had never been able to fully set down. The war. 4 years of it. The tail end of it, anyway. He had been 19 when he enlisted with a Missouri volunteer regiment in 1864, and 22 when it was done. And the man who came home was not quite the same shape as the boy who had left. His mother had noticed. His father had pretended not to. He had written letters home throughout the war, long ones, describing things in the careful, oblique language of a young man trying to tell the truth without frightening the people he loved. After Appomattox, after he came home to find the farm diminished, and his older brother already gone to Texas, after the long, strange silence of trying to be a peacetime person again, the letters had simply stopped. He had nothing to say that he could put into words that would mean what he wanted them to mean. The gap between what he had seen and what words could carry had grown too wide to bridge, and so he had stopped trying. 7 years of silence. He was 29 now, and he had made a life out of movement, cattle drives, ranch work, a little bit of tracking, once a spell as a deputy in a small New Mexico town that he had left before the work became something he could not respect. He had a good horse named Elias, a Winchester rifle, a bedroll, and a reputation for reliability that followed him from one job to the next without him ever having to speak up for himself. He was content enough. He had told himself that for several years and had mostly believed it. He lay back on the rope bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the way Birdie Hayes had extended her hand without any hesitation, as though the most natural thing in the world was to introduce yourself properly to a stranger who might have news of your brother. He thought about the crease of worry between her brows when he mentioned Calvin had gone east. He thought about the missing button on her sleeve and the dust on her hem and the lavender soap underneath all of it, and how all of those things together made a picture of a woman who had traveled a long way on her own, on limited means, for someone she loved. He did not go to sleep for a very long time. At first light, Birdie Hayes was at the livery. She had a brown mare named Frances who was small and sensible looking, and she had repinned her hair and brushed her dress as well as could be managed, and she was talking to Francis in a low voice when Matthew came in leading Elias. She turned and looked at him without surprise, as though she had not spent any time wondering whether he would actually show up. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He helped her check Francis's shoes. One of them was slightly loose, and the livery man banged it back into shape before they left. And then they rode east out of Caldwell as the sun came up gold and flat across the grasslands, and the sky was enormous and the air smelled of sage and the coming cold of late autumn, and Matthew Watkins, who had learned to ride in silence and preferred it, found himself talking. He was not sure when it started. She asked him something about the Chikaskia River territory, a practical question about the terrain, and he answered it, and she asked another question, and he answered that, and somewhere in the back and forth of it he realized they were having a conversation, a real one, the kind where both people are actually listening. She was curious in a systematic way, not chattering but inquiring, wanting to understand the shape of the land they were crossing and the people in it. She knew the basics of homesteading. Her father had filed a claim near Abilene in the early 70s, she told him, and she had grown up doing every kind of farm work. Her mother had died when she and Calvin were young, a fever that came through in the summer of 1869. Her father had raised them both with the pragmatic tenderness of a man who loved his children and expected them to be capable. "He died 2 years ago," she said, not with the wet grief of a recent wound, but with the steady weight of something she carried and had found a way to carry. His heart, the doctor thought. Calvin and I sold the farm. Calvin came west. I stayed in Abilene working in the dry goods store until I had enough put by. The plan was to join him and homestead together. "That's a good plan," Matthew said. "It's the only plan I have," she said, and smiled slightly, and he noticed that the smile did a particular thing at the left corner of her mouth, a small upward curve that arrived a half-second before the rest of the smile, as if it was a little impatient. He told her about the land east of Caldwell. He told her about the homesteading rush that had been pulling young men off the cattle trails all that summer, about the various creek-fed parcels that were being claimed, about the fact that the railroad was pushing south and east, and anyone who got to good land before the tracks arrived stood to do well if they were patient and stubborn. He described Calvin Briggs as he remembered him, a good-natured young man, earnest, who had been working as a hand on the same drive Matthew rode the previous August, and had talked at length about his plan to homestead and about his sister who was coming to join him. He had been a little homesick, Matthew remembered, not complaining about it, just carrying it. "That sounds like him," Birdie said, and the relief in her voice was real and warm. They rode through mid-morning heat that was cut by a decent wind, through the tall grass country where the prairie stretched in every direction as far as a person could see, broken only by the dark lines of creek timber and the occasional low hill. They passed one homestead, a soddy with smoke coming from the chimney and a woman hanging laundry on a line strung between two posts, and Birdie raised a hand to her in greeting, and the woman raised one back, and there was something in that small gesture that caught in Matthew's chest like a splinter. He had been living in the spaces between people for so long that he had stopped noticing what those spaces felt like. He noticed now. At midday they stopped beside a creek called Willow Branch to water the horses and eat the food they had each brought. Birdie had biscuits wrapped in cloth and dried apple slices, and Matthew had hardtack and jerky, and they shared without making a fuss about it, and sat on opposite sides of a flat rock eating companionably while the horses drank. She asked him where he was from, and he told her Missouri, and she asked about his family, and he gave her the short, honest version: mother and father, both gone now, brother in Texas he kept meaning to visit, the farm sold years ago. She nodded, not pressing but not pretending the weight of that was nothing. She asked how long he had been working cattle, and he said since after the war, and a small careful pause settled between them at the word war, the way it always did, that breath people took before deciding how much to ask. She did not ask how much to ask. She simply asked quietly, "Were you very young?" 19, he said. She looked at him with that clear Creekwater gaze. That's very young, she said. A lot of boys were younger, he said, which was true and which was the standard thing he said. That doesn't make 19 less young, she said, which was not the standard response, and he looked at her and found she was not saying it with pity, just with the straightforward factuality of a person refusing to let something be minimized when it should not be. He looked at the creek. No, he said, it doesn't. They rode on after that, and the afternoon opened up around them, and the conversation moved in and out like weather, sometimes quiet for long stretches where the only sounds were hoofbeats and wind in the grass, sometimes carrying easily on everyday things. The best routes for a supply wagon, the difference between Kansas soil and Missouri soil, a question she had about whether winter in the open territory was as severe as people said, which he answered honestly. She listened to hard answers without flinching. He had never realized before how rare that was, to talk to someone who did not need you to soften things into something easier. They found Calvin Briggs the following afternoon. He had filed on a good piece of land along a small tributary of the Chikaskia, a quarter section with decent grass and a natural windbreak of cottonwood trees along the creek. The soddy was half built, the walls up and the roof in progress, and he was on top of the unfinished roof when they rode up, and he looked down and saw his sister, and let out a yell that startled 3 crows out of the cottonwoods. Matthew stayed back while they met, watching Calvin half climb, half fall down the ladder propped against the wall and Birdie dismount in a rush, and the two of them collide in the middle of the yard in the uncomplicated way of siblings who have missed each other and are not embarrassed about it. Calvin was exactly as Matthew remembered him, thin as a fence rail, red-haired, wearing the oversized brown coat, and he was talking a mile a minute about the claim, about the roof, about the neighbor 2 miles north who had a plow he was going to borrow, about how the soil tested well and the grass was good for cattle. Birdie was laughing and crying at the same time and wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, and then she turned and found Matthew still sitting on Elias at the edge of the property, and she called out, "Mr. Watkins, come meet my brother." He rode up and dismounted, and Calvin Briggs shook his hand with tremendous enthusiasm and said he remembered him from the drive and thanked him for bringing Birdie and immediately invited them both to stay. The invitation was so genuine, and the afternoon was getting late enough that riding back to Caldwell that night was a poor idea in any case. Matthew said he would take the offer of the barn, which was built before the house, as was usually the way of things out on the claims. That night, after a supper of beans and salt pork that Birdie made on the small iron stove, Calvin had somehow transported intact from Caldwell, and after Calvin had talked himself nearly hoarse describing everything that had happened since he left Wichita, and after the coals were low in the stove, and Calvin had fallen asleep in his bedroll with the swift completeness of a man who worked hard every day outdoors, Matthew said his good nights and went to the barn. He lay in the clean hay with his hands folded under his head and stared at the dark timbers above him and listened to the wind come across the grass, and he thought about how long it had been since he had sat at a table with people who were glad to see each other, and he thought about Birdie Hayes's laugh, and he thought about what she had said beside Willow Branch Creek, that 19 was very young, and that other boys being younger did not change what that meant. Nobody had said that to him before. In 7 years, nobody had thought to say that simple, plain thing to him. He was not a man who reached for grand explanations of himself. He was not given to examining his own interior with any particular thoroughness. But lying in Calvin Briggs's half-built barn in the darkness, listening to the Kansas wind, he understood that something had shifted in the last 2 days in the same way that ground shifts after a long rain, nothing dramatically broken, but the whole surface resettled into a new configuration. He did not know what to do with that. In the morning, Birdie was up before anyone, and when Matthew came out of the barn, she was at the edge of the property looking east with a cup of coffee in her hands that she had made on the stove before the fire was properly going, which said something about her patience. The sky was enormous and pink and purple in that particular way of early plains mornings, and she was watching it without apparently needing it to be anything other than what it was. He came and stood beside her, not crowding, just near enough. She held out the cup and he took it and drank and handed it back, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the sky changed color above the Chikaskia River country, and somewhere east a meadowlark opened up with the full, unreasonable optimism of its song. "I love it here," she said, finally and with certainty, as though the thought had been building since she arrived and had just finished constructing itself. "It's good land," Matthew said. "It's more than that," she said. "It's big. It makes everything feel possible." He looked at the same horizon she was looking at. He tried to see it the way she was seeing it and found, to his own surprise, that he could. That the bigness of it was not just a geographic fact but something that pushed back against whatever it was he had been carrying for 7 years, not eliminating it but putting it in proportion. Here was a thing that was larger than what he carried. He stayed another day. Calvin needed help with the roof, and Matthew knew how to build, and Birdie was useful and tireless, and the three of them put the sod roof on in good shape before the day was done. Matthew worked alongside Calvin and talked about the claim and the territory, and Birdie worked alongside both of them and at one point was up on the roof herself handing down tools, and Calvin called up to her to be careful, and she said she had been climbing things without supervision since she was 6 and she was perfectly fine. And Matthew, on the ladder below her, looked up and found himself grinning at the ladder rungs. He did not stay a third day. He had the job with Beaumont to get back to, and 3 weeks felt suddenly shorter than it had. He saddled Elias in the morning and came to the door of the soddy and knocked, and Birdie opened it. She had flour on her hands from whatever she was making, and her hair was coming down already in the morning. "You're going," she said. It was not a question. "I have a job to get back to," he said. "Beaumont Ranch west of Caldwell. I'll be through again in a month or so." She looked at him steadily. "That's not a plan to meet again," she said. "That's a polite way of saying goodbye." He held her gaze. "I'd like to come back," he said. The corner of her mouth did that small, impatient thing. "Then say that," she said. "I'd like to come back," he said again, more deliberately this time. "Then come back," she said simply, and wiped her hands on her apron and put her right hand out, and he shook it as he had the first time, and her grip was exactly as firm as he remembered. He rode back west with the morning sun behind him and the whole Flint Hills country ahead, and Elias moved well on the cool morning air, and Matthew Watkins felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time, something that was not peace exactly, and was not happiness in any simple sense, but was more like the particular feeling of having a direction and meaning it. He got back to the Beaumont Ranch in good time and went back to work, and he did his job with the same careful competence he always brought to it, and he was fine. He was perfectly fine, except that in the evenings when the work was done and the other hands were playing cards or cleaning gear or sleeping, Matthew would find himself on the edge of doing something he had not done in 7 years, which was writing things down. He kept stopping himself. He would reach for the pencil stub he kept in his coat pocket for tallying cattle counts and then pull his hand back. He did not know what to say or how to start or whether starting was a good idea at all. He was good at work. He was reliable. He was not a man who wrote letters, not anymore, not since the war stripped the ability to believe that words on paper could carry anything that mattered. But the image of Birdie Hayes at the edge of that property, watching the pink sky with her coffee cup, would not leave him alone, and neither would the sound of her saying, simply and directly, "Then come back," as if the only barrier between a person and the thing they wanted was the decision to say it out loud. He started the letter the night before he rode back east. He got it out of his bedroll, a scrap of paper he had been carrying for no particular reason, and the pencil stub from his pocket, and he sat on his bedroll in the bunkhouse after the other hands were asleep, and he put the pencil to the paper. He wrote, "Dear Miss Hayes." He stared at that for a long time. Then he crossed it out and wrote, "Dear Birdie," and that was better, more honest, so he left it. He wrote, "I am not much of a letter writer. I should tell you that up front, so you know what you are getting. I used to write them. During the war, I wrote to my mother every few weeks for 4 years, and when the war was over, I stopped, and I have not written one since. I am not sure why I am writing this one, except that I find myself thinking about things I would like to say to you, and there is considerable distance between here and the Chikaskia River, so this seems like the next best thing to saying them." He stopped and read it back. It was more words than he had said to most people in a year. He kept going. He wrote about the drive coming up, about the territory and what winter would look like on the Chikaskia claim, about practical things. Calvin would want to know about the soil and the water and the kinds of crops that did well, and the kind that struggled in Kansas winters. He wrote about Elias, which probably did not interest her but which was the thing that came to him, and so he wrote it. He wrote about the meadowlark he heard every morning at the Beaumont Ranch, outside the bunkhouse window, the same one he was fairly certain because it started in exactly the same spot every day, and how he had started listening for it deliberately, which was something he had not done before, listened for a small particular sound on purpose because it was good. He wrote, "I think you do that to people, make them notice things they were walking past before. I am not sure how to say that without it sounding more dramatic than I mean it. I just mean that I noticed the meadowlark." He stopped again and considered whether to cross that out. He left it. He wrote for a very long time. The bunkhouse got cold and then colder, and the other hands shifted in their sleep, and a horse stamped in the barn outside, and the stars turned over the roof, and Matthew Watkins wrote until the early gray of dawn started in the window, and then he looked at what he had produced, 4 pages of small handwriting on whatever paper he had found. The backs of a few tally sheets and the scrap and a piece of brown paper from the cook's supply stores that he had asked for, and which the cook had given him with no comment because it was a cook's business to hand things over without judgment, and he felt something he had not expected to feel. He felt lighter, not fixed, not solved. Just lighter, like he had set something down that he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten it had weight. He folded the pages carefully and addressed the outside to Miss Birdie Hayes, Chikaskia River Claim, east of Caldwell, Kansas, which he knew was not a proper postal address, but which he thought probably Calvin Briggs would be the person picking up mail from the Caldwell post office, and that Calvin would know it was for his sister. He rode east the following week, after the Beaumont drive was done, with the letter in his coat pocket because there had been no opportunity to post it, and because some part of him was not sure he wanted to mail it cold. He wanted to know first whether she would be glad to see him, whether the thing he had felt riding away from that claim was mutual in any degree, because he was a man who liked to understand the ground before he put weight on it. He rode into the Chikaskia claim on a gray afternoon, with winter coming in from the north, and the soddy had smoke coming from it, and Calvin was in the near field doing something with fence posts. He raised a hand in greeting and shouted that Birdie was inside, and Matthew tied Elias to the post by the barn and went to the door. Birdie opened it before he knocked. She had clearly heard him ride up. She was standing in the doorway with an expression he could not read immediately, not guarded, but careful, as if she was waiting to see what he would do before she decided what she thought of it. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," he said. "You did," she agreed, and something in her face settled, and she stepped back to let him in. The inside of the soddy was clean and organized with the evident thoroughness of a woman who had grown up understanding that in a small space, order was not a luxury but a necessity. There was a shelf of supplies, a small table with 2 chairs, the iron stove working hard against the November chill, and on the table a small stack of books, 3 of them, which out on the frontier represented something, represented someone who had chosen to carry books over things of more obvious practical value. He took out the letter and put it on the table. She looked at it, then she looked at him. "I'm not a letter writer," he said, which was what he had written in the letter's opening line and which seemed like the right thing to say now too. "I haven't been for a long time, but I wrote this, and I'd rather give it to you in person than send it cold." She picked it up. She looked at the folded pages. It was thick, thicker than a practical communication needed to be, and he saw her register that. She looked at him for another moment, and then she set the letter carefully on the shelf beside the books, not reading it yet, which told him something. She was keeping it for later, for private, which told him it mattered. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." He sat, and she made coffee on the stove, and they talked through the afternoon while the wind picked up outside and the temperature dropped, and Calvin came in at dark, stamping cold off his boots, and enormously pleased to see Matthew, and they ate together again around the table, and it was the same warmth as before but with something added, the awareness that this was becoming a pattern, which was a different thing from a single occurrence. After Calvin went to sleep, Matthew and Birdie sat by the stove with the lamp between them, and she read the letter. He watched her read it. He was not sure what he expected. He had never written anything like that before, not since the war and not then in the same way, and he was prepared for a number of different responses. She read carefully and thoroughly, the way she did everything, not skimming. Her face did not give much away while she was reading, but he noticed when she reached the part about the meadowlark, because her chin came up a degree, and she looked at the lamp for a moment, and then back at the page with an expression he could not name but which felt like something important. She finished and folded it neatly and held it in her lap with both hands. "Matthew," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and he felt it in the same way you feel a change in the wind, not dramatically but definitively. "Yes," he said. "Why did you stop writing letters?" He had not expected that to be the first thing she said. He thought about deflecting, which was his habit, which was the practiced reflex of 7 years of being a man without open wounds. He looked at her face in the lamplight and found the same clear directness he had found at the Dusty Rose and at Willow Branch Creek, and at the edge of the property watching the pink sky, and he understood that directness was not something she would withdraw if he gave her an honest answer. She would not flinch from it. "Because I couldn't make the words carry what they needed to carry," he said. "After the war, I tried a few times, and what came out was either too small or too large, and neither of them was right. So I stopped. It seemed better to stop than to keep producing things that weren't true." "What made this one different?" she asked. He looked at the fire. "I didn't have to explain things," he said slowly. "With my mother I had to explain, I had to translate. With you, you already know the shape of hard things. I don't have to make it smaller or larger. I can just say it the actual size it is." The fire cracked in the stove. The wind pushed at the soddy walls with its flat prairie weight. Birdie Hayes looked at him with those October Creekwater eyes. "I think you should keep writing," she said, "and I think I should write back." He looked at her. "You want to write back?" "I want to write back," she said plainly. And that was, Matthew Watkins thought, the most extraordinary statement he had heard in a very long time. He rode out the next morning, because he had work to get back to and because the first snow was coming in and travel would be harder within the week. But he said goodbye differently than before. He said he would be back in the spring, and he meant it as a real promise rather than a polite direction. And when he said it, Birdie looked at him with that half-secondarily corner smile and said she would have letters waiting. She did. He picked up the first one in December at the Caldwell post office, having come down from the Beaumont Ranch for supplies. The postmaster, an elderly man named Hollies who had been postmaster since before the town was a proper town, handed him the envelope with the mild expression of a man who did not comment on people's correspondence. Matthew took the letter to the general store where he had a tab and sat in the corner with a cup of coffee the storekeeper's wife brought without being asked. She was that kind of woman, and he opened the letter. Birdie's handwriting was precise and slightly angular, with occasional ink pressure variations that suggested she wrote quickly and pressed harder when she was emphasizing something to herself. She began with the practical news of the claim. Calvin had finished the barn before the snow came, which was a near thing, and they had 2 horses and 4 chickens now, acquired from a neighbor 3 miles north who was thinning his stock for winter. The claim was holding well, the soil tested as good as they had hoped. She described the first snow on the plains in language that was spare but precise, and he could see it through her words. The way the grass went white and the cottonwoods along the creek went silverbark gray against it, the enormous silence that settled when the wind stopped and the flakes came straight down. Then she wrote, "You said you couldn't make the words carry what they needed to. I have thought about that since you left. I think what you are actually saying is that the people you were writing to couldn't receive what you were trying to send. That is a different problem than the words. I don't know if this is true, I am only guessing, but I think it might be worth considering. In any case, I am glad you picked up the pen again, whatever the reason. Yours, Birdie Hayes." Matthew read that paragraph 3 times. Then he sat for a while with his coffee growing cold and looked out the window at the winter street of Caldwell, at the horses at the hitching rail and the gray sky and the smoke from the various chimneys, and felt something move through him that was the literary equivalent of what Birdie had said about the Kansas plains. It made everything feel possible. He wrote back that evening at the Beaumont Ranch bunkhouse. The other hands, by now, had noticed and drawn their own conclusions and were gentlemen enough not to say too much about it. Joe, the oldest of them, a former Georgia man named Joe Farley who had come west after the war and never gone back, caught Matthew writing at the table one night and said only, "Good for you, son," and meant it without irony, and went back to his bunk. The letters went back and forth through the winter like a conversation across a long table. Birdie wrote about the claim and about Calvin's courtship of the neighbor's daughter, a fact which had emerged by January and which Birdie reported with fond exasperation. She wrote about the books she had brought, a copy of Middlemark, which Matthew had not read, and a collection of poetry, and a guide to prairie horticulture. And she described what she was reading in the evenings by the lamp with the thoroughness of someone who had found in books the company that geography denied her. Matthew wrote back about the herd work and the territory and about things he remembered, and had not said to anyone, small particular things that had lodged in him during the war and stayed there. Not the large horrors, but the small precise details, the exact color of the Virginia clay in rain, the sound of a regimental band playing too far away to identify the tune, the particular quality of a February morning in a camp outside Petersburg when he was 20 years old and had not yet learned that the correct response to a world that might kill you was not to feel less, but to feel everything very carefully, because you might not get to feel it again. He wrote those things and sent them and did not regret them, which was new. In February, she wrote, "I read what you said about Petersburg. I have been thinking about what it means to be 20 years old and know that. I think most people learn that the world is dangerous in small ways by degrees through ordinary losses. You learned it all at once at 19 and then had to spend the rest of your life integrating it. That seems like enormous work. I don't say this for pity's sake. I say it because I think understanding the shape of a thing is the first step to carrying it better. I hope the letters help with that. They help me too, in ways I am still working out." He read that one even more times than he had read the paragraph about words and receiving. He read it until the page was soft at the fold lines. In March, when the snow broke and the first warmth came back into the Kansas air, he rode east to the Chikaskia claim. Calvin met him in the yard with obvious pleasure and also obvious tact, finding reasons to be in the far field for most of the afternoon. Birdie met him at the door as before, but this time there was less careful stillness in her face, less waiting. She simply looked glad, openly and without reservation, in the way she seemed to do everything without apology. "You look well," she said. "So do you," he said, and it was true, and more than true. She looked like someone who had spent a winter doing hard work in cold, clean air, and had come out the other side of it entirely herself. No edges worn down, no corners softened, just Birdie Hayes more fully arrived in her own life. They walked the claim that afternoon, because she wanted to show him what Calvin had done over the winter and what she had planned for the kitchen garden. And she described the planting schedule with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had been thinking about it for months. And Matthew walked beside her and listened and asked questions. And at one point she reached out to show him the soil quality in a test patch she had dug, and her hand was right beside his hand in the turned earth, and they both noticed that at the same time. They were quiet for a moment. The spring wind moved through the cottonwoods. Then Birdie sat back on her heels and looked at him with a kind of measured directness that he had come to know as her version of gathering herself. "Matthew," she said. "Yes," he said, because that particular tone of voice required a yes rather than anything else. "The letters have been, I look forward to them," she said. "More than I look forward to most things. More than I have looked forward to something in a long time." He looked at her. "Same," he said. "I don't want to mistake it for something it isn't," she said, "because I think you have been alone a long time, and loneliness can make things look like things they're not." "That's true," he said, and respected her for saying it because it was the kind of honest guard against foolishness that he had not permitted himself but should have. "Is that what you think this is?" She was quiet for a moment, turning a clod of dark soil in her fingers. "No," she said finally, "I don't think it is. I think it's the other thing." "The other thing," he said. She looked at him directly with those October brown eyes. "The thing where you meet someone and they become the person you most want to talk to," she said. "And then they become the person you most want to be near. And then you realize those two facts constitute something you probably ought to name." He was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight and rightness of what she had just said, turning it over the way she was turning the soil clod in her hand. "Birdie," he said. "Yes," she said, mirroring him back. "I am in love with you," he said. "I don't think I was planning to say that today, but there it is, since we're naming things." The corner of her mouth did that early smile again, and then the whole smile followed it, and it was the cleanest, most uncomplicated expression of happiness he had ever seen on a person's face, not surprised, not flustered, just glad, entirely and without reservation glad. "Well," she said, "that makes two of us." He took the soil clod out of her hand very gently and set it aside, and he took her hand instead, and they stayed like that in the turned earth of the kitchen garden with the spring wind and the cottonwoods and the enormous Kansas sky going a particular shade of pale gold above them. And it was not dramatic. It was better than dramatic. It was the feeling of a thing that had been true for a while and was now being acknowledged, which is a different and quieter and more permanent kind of event. They told Calvin at supper that evening, which made Calvin so happy he nearly knocked the lamp off the shelf. Calvin had his own news, which was that he had asked the neighbor's daughter, her name was Louise, and she was a composed young woman of 20 with good sense and a tolerant disposition to marry him, and she had said yes, and he had been waiting for the right moment to tell Birdie, and apparently this was it. The supper turned into something celebratory, and Calvin produced a bottle of whiskey he had been keeping for a special occasion, and even Birdie had a small amount, and they sat around the table in the lamplight, and the wind came across the prairie and shook the door gently in its frame, and Matthew Watkins sat with Birdie's hand in his under the table and felt something so large and quiet settle over him that he did not have a word for it. He thought about reaching for a word, and then decided to simply inhabit it instead. He had a word for it later, lying in the barn again, because Calvin's home, however celebratory the evening, had one room and certain proprieties staring at the dark rafters. The word was home, not the soddy itself, not the particular patch of Kansas prairie, not even the Chikaskia River territory. The word was home, meaning the people, meaning the table and the lamp and the hand under the table, meaning the feeling of being in the presence of someone who knew the actual size of things and received you accordingly. He had not felt it since before the war. He had stopped believing it was something he would feel again. He went to Caldwell the following week and talked to the land office, and to a lawyer who had a practice above the general store, a thin, efficient man named Pierce who had come from Cincinnati and understood the homestead laws thoroughly. Matthew filed on an adjacent parcel of land a quarter section east of Calvin's claim, sharing the Cottonwood Creek, good land, comparable soil. It had been available because the first man to file on it had gone back east the previous winter without developing it, and the abandonment had opened it up. He went back to Beaumont Ranch and finished out his remaining commitment, which was 3 more weeks, and explained to Beaumont that he would not be resigning. Beaumont shook his hand and said Matthew was the best man he'd had, and if he ever needed work again to come back, and Matthew said he appreciated that, and Beaumont looked at him with the assessment of a man who had been hiring and reading people for 20 years. "You found a piece of land?" Beaumont asked. "A piece of land," Matthew confirmed. "A woman?" Matthew considered. "Both," he said. Beaumont smiled, which was a rare event. "Well then," he said. Matthew rode back to the Chikaskia claim with his bedroll, his rifle, his tools, his horse Elias, and $73 in cash savings, and he started building. He had built things before: the bunkhouse at Beaumont's, sections of the soddy roof on Calvin's claim, and before the war, barn work on the Missouri farm. Building was not a mystery to him. He was methodical and he planned carefully. And through the spring and into the summer he put up a proper soddy on his parcel, and then a barn, and started breaking ground for the first fields. Calvin and Birdie were 2 miles east, and Birdie rode over on Francis most days. She said she was helping with the building, which was true, but she was also clearly watching the shape of the place he was creating and imagining herself in it, and Matthew let her do that without comment because it made her happy, and because he liked watching her think. She had opinions about everything: the placement of the windows to catch light, the angle of the kitchen garden for drainage, the wisdom of planting winter wheat versus spring wheat in the first year, and she delivered them with the same cheerful firmness she had used to argue with Gerald Morse at the Dusty Rose, and he found he wanted to hear every one of them. One afternoon in early June she stood in the middle of the half-built structure that would be the main room of the house, a proper house, not just a soddy. He was building with lumber hauled from Caldwell because it was what he wanted, a real house for a real life, and she looked at the walls and the window frames and the view to the south where the creek bent through the cottonwoods. "Matthew," she said. "I know," he said, because he did. "Are you asking me?" she said, and there was the corner smile, impatient and warm. "I am asking you," he said. He was on his knees in the dirt fixing a floorboard, and he looked up at her from there, which was not a planned posture for a proposal but which seemed honest and appropriate. "Birdie Hayes, will you marry me and live on this claim with me and argue with me about window placement for the rest of our lives?" She laughed, the clean, warm laugh he had first heard in the Dusty Rose and which had not stopped being extraordinary to him. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He stood up and she crossed the half-built room and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face briefly against the side of his neck, and he held her in the June sunlight that came through the unglazed window opening, and the meadows smelled of grass and turned earth and everything that was growing. They were married in September of 1879 in the Caldwell Methodist Church, which was a simple white building that had been built the previous year. Birdie wore the best dress she had, which was a deep blue wool that brought out the gold flecks in her eyes, and she had her hair put up properly, and she wore her mother's small pearl earrings which she had carried all the way from Abilene in the bottom of her bag. Matthew wore a new coat, which was the most formal preparation he had managed, and Calvin stood up beside him and Louise stood beside Birdie, and the minister was a young man from Ohio who performed the ceremony with evident sincerity. When Matthew said "I do," he said it looking at Birdie's face, and she was looking back at him with that clear, open gaze, and it was not a moment of high drama or overwhelming emotion, but of the quiet, enormous certainty that comes when something you have been moving toward for a long time finally arrives and turns out to be exactly what you thought it would be, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable than most things. After the ceremony, Calvin took Louise's hand and they walked out ahead, into the September afternoon, where the courthouse square was busy with Saturday traffic, and a few people paused to smile at a wedding couple emerging from the church. Matthew and Birdie came out behind them and stood on the church steps in the warm light. "Mrs. Watkins," he said, testing it. She turned her face up to him. "I have been Birdie Hayes my entire life," she said, but she was smiling. "I suppose I can be Birdie Watkins." "You can be both," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think I will be." He kissed her there on the church steps in Caldwell, Kansas, in September of 1879, and it was not a church-appropriate kiss in terms of its duration, and a few people in the square noticed, and two old men at the general store across the street tipped their hats and grinned, and Matthew did not care even slightly, because Birdie was kissing him back with the same wholehearted directness she brought to everything. They went home to the Chikaskia River claim as the afternoon turned golden, riding side by side on Elias and Francis through the tall grass country that was going bronze and amber in the autumn, and the sky was the deep blue of a September evening over the Kansas plains, and the cottonwoods along the creek were yellow, and the house Matthew had built stood at the edge of the claim, with its south windows catching the last of the light. That evening Birdie made a proper supper on the iron stove they had hauled from Caldwell on a wagon in August, and they ate it at the table by the lamp, and afterward she read from Middlemark while he worked on the fence calculations for the east pasture, and the wind came across the prairie the same as it always had, but it felt different from inside a room that was theirs, in a house that was theirs, at the end of a day that had been one of the best he could remember. He wrote in his journal that night. He had started keeping one, which was a new thing, a development of the letter-writing habit that had turned out to have its own life. He wrote about the day and the ceremony and the September light and the way Birdie had looked on the church steps, and he wrote, "I did not know what I was riding toward when I walked into the dusty rows in Caldwell a year ago. I knew I was riding in circles, which is not the same thing as going nowhere but is also not a destination. I have one now. I have her. I have this ground. The first winter of their marriage was long and cold and entirely good." They were not alone. Calvin and Louise were 2 miles east, and there was the network of homestead families along the river, people who visited in the intervals between storms and who leaned on each other for the practical interdependence that survival on the frontier required. Matthew learned the names of his neighbors and their claims and their needs, and Birdie learned them faster, because she had the kind of warmth that made people tell her things, and within months she was at the center of a web of connections that stretched for miles in every direction. She helped Louise through a difficult patch of winter illness, and sat with the Hendrickson family 3 miles north when their youngest child was sick with croup, and organized a cooperative seed order in February through the Caldwell Merchant that saved everyone on the river cluster significant money. Matthew watched her do all of this with the admiration of someone observing a person operating at their natural capacity, which is one of the finest things one person can witness in another. He was building the farm. By spring of 1880, they had 20 acres of winter wheat coming in, and a good vegetable garden and 8 cattle. He had traded work with Calvin and with John Hendrickson to the north, and the 3 claims together were forming the kind of loose working partnership that made all 3 viable in ways none of them would be alone. He rode into Caldwell for supplies and trade and news, and he knew the territory thoroughly now, every creek crossing and weather sign and which roads held up in wet weather. He was content. More than content, he was grounded, in the literal and also the larger sense, tied to a piece of earth he owned and worked and was making into something, and tied to a person who met him daily in the full honesty of who they both were, without performance or pretense. He wrote to his brother Thomas in Texas that spring. He had not written in 3 years, which was its own kind of wound. He wrote 2 pages, honest and full, telling Thomas about the claim and about Birdie and about Calvin and Louise, and about what the Kansas plains looked like in early spring when the grass came back and the meadowlarks returned, and the sky was that clear, improbable blue. Thomas wrote back within the month, a letter full of his own news. He had a ranch outside of San Antonio, a wife named Clara, 2 children, and at the end of the letter he wrote, "I was beginning to think you had disappeared entirely. I am glad you found your way, brother. Come visit when you can." Matthew showed that letter to Birdie, and she read it and looked at him with the particular expression she had for moments when something previously closed had opened. "When can we go?" she said. "Come harvest," he said. "Come harvest then," she said, and that was how it was decided. In the spring of 1880, Birdie told him she was expecting a child. She told him the way she told him everything, directly and calmly, and with her eyes fully on his face, watching for his reaction with the quiet attentiveness she gave to things that mattered. He looked at her for a moment, and then he put his arms around her and held on, and he did not say anything for a while because there was a great deal happening inside him that needed a moment to arrange itself into something coherent. "Are you all right?" she asked his shoulder with a slight amusement under the genuine question. "Better than all right," he managed. "A great deal better." She laughed into his coat. "Good," she said. "Because I am going to need you to be very calm and practical about this entire matter, Matthew, because I intend to keep working the garden until at least September." "Of course you do," he said, "and I don't want a fuss." "You won't get one," he said. "You'll get help." She pulled back and looked at him. "You understand there is a difference." "I understand," he said, and he did, because Birdie Hayes Watkins was not a woman who wanted to be managed or coddled, but was entirely willing to receive competent assistance, which was a distinction he had understood since the day she told him she was not Charity. Their son was born in December of 1880, in the middle of a blue norther that came down from the north with the particular vicious commitment of a Kansas winter storm. And it was a good thing they had not waited to get the house properly built, because the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 12 hours, and the wind hit the walls of the house with a force that made the lamp flames bow. Birdie labored through it with the focused intensity she brought to all difficult work, and Louise came through the storm on horseback because she was Birdie's closest neighbor and friend, and there was no power on earth that was going to keep her away, and the doctor from Caldwell had been sent for, but did not arrive until after the fact because the storm made the roads impassable for half the day. So it was Louise and Matthew, and Birdie directing both of them with impressive composure in between bouts of doing the hard, necessary work that was entirely hers to do, and the storm shook the house, and the stove burned hot, and at 2 in the morning the baby arrived in a rush of tremendous noise and life. Matthew held his son for the first time and looked at the small, red, furious face, and felt every version of love he had ever known arrive simultaneously in a wave that made him sit down suddenly on the edge of the bed, because his legs decided they were not needed for a moment. He was aware that he was crying, which was not something he had done in front of anyone in a very long time, and he did not try to stop it because Birdie was watching him with the most luminous expression he had ever seen on her face, exhausted and radiant and entirely herself. "Hello," he said to his son, who had quieted slightly and was looking at nothing with the unfocused intensity of the newly born. "I'm your father. I've been waiting for you." They named him Thomas James Watkins, Thomas for Matthew's brother and James for Birdie's father. Calvin and Louise came over the day after the storm broke to meet him, and Calvin held the baby with the extreme careful incompetence of a young man holding a newborn for the first time, and Louise corrected his grip with the confidence of someone who had younger siblings, and Birdie watched them both from the bed with a tired smile, and Matthew watched Birdie, and outside the storm had blown itself out, and the world was brilliant white and entirely still in the way of post-storm mornings. The sky an impossible blue. He wrote to Thomas in Texas that week, a long letter with the news, and Thomas wrote back with equal enthusiasm and a promise to come north in the spring, which he did. He came up from San Antonio in April with Clara and their 2 children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, and stayed for 2 weeks and worked alongside Matthew on the spring planting, and sat with Birdie in the evenings talking in the easy way of people who were already family and discovering they were also going to be friends. Thomas and Matthew went for a long ride one afternoon, while Clara and Birdie sat on the porch with the baby between them, and talked with the comfortable fluency of women who had found each other to be the kind of person they could speak honestly with. Thomas and Matthew rode east along the river without saying much for a while, which was the way the Watkins brothers had always communicated, in the comfortable silences of men who had grown up doing physical work side by side. "You're happy," Thomas said eventually, not as a question. "Yes," Matthew said. "You weren't for a long time," Thomas said, not accusing, just observing. "No," Matthew said. "What changed?" Matthew thought about the Dusty Rose saloon and the clean, warm laugh he had heard across the noise of it and the letter he had written until dawn. "I stopped holding still," he said. "I kept moving for a long time, thinking that was the same thing as living. It isn't." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Clara says the same thing about me sometimes," he said, "that I mistake working for living." "She's probably right," Matthew said. Thomas laughed. "I'm absolutely certain she is," he said. That's the baffling thing about smart women. Being married to one is a continuous education. They rode back to the claim in the late afternoon light, and the house was ahead of them, solid and square against the sky, with smoke coming from the chimney and the sound of voices from the porch, and the baby's occasional contribution to the conversation making Clara and Birdie laugh, and Thomas pulled up his horse for a moment and looked at it. "You built that," he said. "With some help," Matthew said. Thomas looked at him with an expression that was proud and fond and slightly rueful, all at once. "Good, Matthew," he said simply. The years after that were the kind that do not contain dramatic events, but are the actual substance of a life well lived. The years of work and weather and harvests good and poor, of neighbors and their difficulties, of the children who arrived. Young Thomas grew into a loud, confident, curious boy who wanted to be involved in every aspect of the farm, with an intensity that was exhausting and wonderful. In 1883, Birdie had their second child, a girl they named Me, who arrived in summer rather than in a blizzard and was attended properly by the Caldwell doctor, and came into the world with a calm watchfulness that made the doctor say, "This one is going to be a thinker," and which turned out to be accurate. Calvin and Louise had their first child in 1882, another boy, and the two families wove together in the comfortable interdependence of people who lived close and worked in common. The children grew up between the two claims, in and out of each other's homes, and Calvin became something between a neighbor and a brother to Matthew, which was another thing Matthew had not known he was missing until he had it. The territory changed around them. The railroad came through, as Matthew had predicted, and Caldwell grew from a cow town into something more substantial, and the Cherokee Strip to the south was the subject of increasing pressure and negotiation between the federal government and the Cherokee Nation, which was an injustice in plain sight that most of the settlers around them treated as simply the way things were, and which Matthew and Birdie talked about with the careful seriousness it deserved. The Cherokee and other nations had been moved, displaced, promised things, and had those promises broken, cycle after cycle, and the pressure on the Strip to open it to settlement was building year by year. Matthew had ridden through that country and knew its people by sight and reputation, and understood enough to know that whatever was coming was not coming with adequate recognition of what had already been taken, which was a sorrow and a wrong that sat heavy on him when he thought about it, and which Birdie felt equally, and said so, with characteristic directness, when the subject came up with neighbors who were less inclined to think about it. In 1885, they had their third child, another boy, who they named Samuel for no family reason, but simply because it suited him when they saw him. And Samuel proved to be the kind of child who was entirely agreeable about everything as long as he got his way, which made him sound troublesome in description, and was in practice the most cheerful, easy personality in the family. Matthew was 36 years old in 1885, and when he stood at the edge of his east field in the early mornings and looked out over the land and the creek and the cottonwoods, and smelled the particular smell of the Chikaskia River country in whatever season was current, he felt the accumulated weight of what he had built here and what it meant, not with vanity, but with the quiet, steady satisfaction of a man who had found his right work and done it faithfully. He still wrote. He wrote in his journal, which by 1885 was 7 volumes of observations and recollections, and he wrote letters to Thomas in Texas, to Joe Farley, the old Georgia man from the Beaumont Ranch who had gone back to Georgia in 1881, and wrote occasionally about his garden, to a few other friends of the cattle-driving years who had scattered to various parts of the West. He wrote carefully and truthfully, in the way he had learned with Birdie, making the words carry the actual size of things rather than something smaller or larger. And he and Birdie continued to write to each other. This was a thing that had started with the letters across a winter and had never entirely stopped, even when they were in the same house. They wrote notes to each other that they left in particular places. A note on the breakfast table, tucked under the coffee cup. A note slipped into the book she was reading. A note in his coat pocket that he found when he rode into Caldwell and read at the bar of the general store, with the storekeeper's wife pretending she wasn't watching with enormous interest. The notes were sometimes practical and sometimes funny, and sometimes the kind of thing that could only be said in writing, in the private space between a pen and a person who knew how to receive it. It was Birdie's idea, he thought later. She had said, that night by the lamp in Calvin's soddy, that the letters helped her too, and she had proven it. She understood, with the particular insight she had into all emotional mechanics, that Matthew had found in the written word a channel for things that did not come easily in speech, and she had not asked him to abandon that channel when they were close enough to speak. She had instead made herself an equally fluent writer, and the written conversation between them had been running alongside the spoken one for years, and together they covered everything. On a Tuesday evening in October of 1887, Matthew came in from the east pasture late, and Birdie was at the table feeding Samuel, who was 2, and me was doing the slow, serious work of a 4-year-old attempting to read, and Thomas was supposed to be doing his arithmetic. The lamp was lit and the stove was going, and the house smelled of cornbread and wood smoke. He stood in the doorway for a moment before anyone noticed him, just looking. Me looked up first and said, "Papa," and went back to her reading. Samuel reached toward him with his customary, indiscriminate enthusiasm. Thomas looked up from what was definitely not arithmetic and scrambled to look like it was. Birdie glanced over her shoulder at him with the expression she had for him that was different from all her other expressions, the one that arrived on her face when he walked into a room, which was not a dramatic look and which was not, perhaps, visible to anyone who did not know to look for it, but which said, plainly and continuously, "I am glad you are here." He came in and shut the door on the October evening and sat down at the table, and Samuel immediately escalated his demands, and me showed him the word she had just learned, and Thomas confessed to the arithmetic situation and accepted the consequences with the philosophically calm of a 7-year-old who knows the consequences are not that bad, and Birdie served supper and sat across from him in the lamplight, and her knee bumped his knee under the table, which was not accidental. He found a note in his coat pocket the following morning, when he rode out to repair the north fence, a fold of paper in Birdie's angular handwriting that said simply, "Last night, watching you come through the door. That is what I keep." He read it standing in the field with his horse at his shoulder, and the October sky enormous above him, and the cottonwoods going gold at the creek, and something moved through him that was 7 years of silence and the dusty rose and a woman's clear water gaze and a letter written until dawn, and all the letters after, and all the words that had finally found people who could carry them. He carried the note in his pocket for a month before it disintegrated from handling, and then he wrote it in his journal so it would not be lost. In 1889, the land run opened the unassigned lands in Oklahoma Territory, and the territory around the Chikaskia changed in character almost overnight as new settlers moved through on their way south. Matthew watched it with the complex feeling of a man who understood what progress meant in terms of individual human striving, and also what it had cost and continued to cost the peoples who had held that land before. And he was not able to celebrate it with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of some of his neighbors, and Birdie was not either, and they did not pretend otherwise. What they did was know their own land and their own obligations, to the ground they farmed, to the people around them, to their children who would inherit whatever world they made here. They had a long conversation about that one night after the children were asleep, Birdie sitting with her feet tucked under her on the chair by the stove and her tea growing cold as it did when she was talking about something that required her full attention. "We are part of a system that takes more than it gives back in some directions," she said. "That's a true thing. It doesn't mean everything we've built is wrong. It means we have to know what it cost and not pretend we don't." "And pass that on," Matthew said. "To Thomas especially," she said. "He's already got the kind of confidence that can become not looking if nobody corrects it." "He gets it from you," Matthew said. She gave him a look over the rim of her teacup. "He absolutely does not." "He's got your jaw," Matthew said. "That is a physical characteristic, not a personality trait," she said with great dignity, and he laughed and she laughed, and the stove cracked in the comfortable silence after. Thomas, at 9, was indeed developing the forceful personality that came from being both a firstborn and inherently bold. And Matthew and Birdie navigated that with the ongoing collaboration of parents who agreed on fundamentals and disagreed on methods with the regular productive friction of two people who are both right about different parts of the same thing. Me was 6 and reading everything she could find, which meant that Birdie's 3 books had been supplemented by significant effort. She arranged book-sharing schemes with 3 other homestead families over a 20-mile radius, and me moved through their combined library with a systematic determination that was entirely her mother's nature expressed in a child-sized version. Samuel, at 4, was a golden-tempered, easily delighted person who had apparently decided that the world was an agreeable place and intended to treat it accordingly, and who was adored by everyone who met him with a completeness that would have been worrying if he hadn't also proven to have a sincere kindness underneath the charm. In the spring of 1890, Birdie found out she was expecting again, and she told Matthew in the kitchen on a March morning with her usual directness, and he looked at her. She was 34 and he was 40, and the farm was strong and the children were good and the life they had built on this piece of Kansas earth was solid in every way that mattered, and he felt that same wave of simultaneous everything that had hit him the first time. 4, he said. 4, she agreed, without apparent distress. She was drinking her coffee and looking at the window and the early spring light on the pasture. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm very well, actually," she said. "I feel fine." "I'm only telling you now so you have time to adjust before you start hovering." "I don't hover," he said. She gave him the look. "I am occasionally nearby," he said. "Hovering," she said pleasantly, and drank her coffee. He hovered with moderate restraint through the spring and summer. Their 4th child, a girl they named Clara after Thomas's wife, a gesture that made Clara in Texas weep happy tears when she got the letter, was born in November of 1890, a small determined girl with dark hair like Birdie's, and Matthew was fairly certain, an expression of mild skepticism she had come into the world already wearing. Calvin and Louise came over the following week with their 3 children, and the house was full of noise and competing energy, and every person in it was fed somehow, and the occasion required 2 pies that Louise had brought and 3 that Birdie had made. And at one point, Matthew stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room and counted 9 children between the 2 families, all of them engaged in something, the combined sound of them filling the house to the rafters, and Birdie at the center of it with Clara on her arm looking entirely at home in the beautiful chaos. He thought about the Dusty Rose Saloon. He thought about the man he had been: competent, reliable, entirely alone, riding in circles in the shape of a life that moved but did not go anywhere, nursing whiskeys he did not finish and asking no questions that might require answers that led somewhere. He thought about a laugh he had heard across a room and turned toward without permission from himself. He wrote about it that night, long after everyone had gone and the children were asleep and Birdie was asleep too, Clara tucked in the cradle beside the bed, and the house quiet with the particular quiet of a full house at rest. He wrote in his journal by the lamp on the kitchen table, the same table where he and Birdie had sat for 11 years, and he wrote about the man he had been, and the life he had found and the woman who was the axis of it, and he wrote about what it meant to have been silent for 7 years, and to have picked up a pen for the right reason at the right moment, and discovered that the words were there, that they had always been there, waiting for someone who could receive them. He wrote, "I think the silence was not about the war specifically, though the war started it. I think it was about not knowing, for a long time, whether the words could matter, whether there was anyone on the other end of them who would understand the actual size of what was being said. She understood from the beginning. She always understood exactly, and because she understood, I could say anything true." He wrote until the lamp needed refilling, and then he refilled it and wrote more. He was not trying to make sense of something that needed making sense of. He was simply recording, which was the thing he had learned to do, to write things down, not to solve them, but to honor them, to say these things happened and they were real, and they will not be forgotten as long as I can hold a pen. He wrote about Thomas and me and Samuel and Clara, each of them in their particular present form, the particular details that made each of them themselves. He wrote about the Chikaskia River country in November, the way the cottonwoods went bare and the grass went gray-brown and the sky dropped down low and white with the approaching winter. He wrote about Calvin Briggs, who was the best neighbor a man could ask for and who had somehow become one of his closest friends, and about Louise, who had grown from a composed 20-year-old into a formidable and funny woman he was glad to know. He wrote about the meadowlark at the Beaumont Ranch that he had listened for deliberately, because a woman at the edge of a homestead claim had made him notice things he had been walking past. He wrote, "She is asleep in the other room with our daughter beside her and our children in their beds and the farm quiet around us and the prairie going dark and cold outside the walls of this house that I built with my hands. I built it for her. I built it for us. I could not have built it without having been the person I was, the silent man on the edge of things, because you cannot get from there to here without traveling the distance, and the distance was what it was. I don't regret any of it. Not the war, not the silence, not the years of moving. They brought me here. She is here. That is what they were for." He sat for a while after he put the pen down, listening to the house breathe around him. The stove had burned low and he added wood and watched the fire take it up, and the lamp made its steady warm circle on the table, and the night was very still outside. Then he went to the bedroom doorway and looked in. Birdie was asleep with the easy completeness of a person who had worked hard and had nothing to trouble her rest, her hair loose and dark across the pillow, one hand curled near her face. Clara was in the cradle, her small breathing audible in the stillness. The room smelled of wood smoke and lavender soap. She had never stopped with the lavender soap, even out on the frontier, and the smell of it was permanently associated in Matthew's mind with every good thing. He went back to the kitchen and sat at the table and looked at his journal, the pages covered in his handwriting, and he felt the same thing he had felt the morning after the first letter: lighter, like something set down. Like the proper weight of a man who has put his full life into words and found that the words were adequate to carry it. He picked up the pen again, turned to a new page, and began a note to Birdie, which he would tuck under her coffee cup in the morning. He wrote, "I have been at this table since the children went down, writing. I will tell you more tomorrow, all of it, if you want to hear it, and I think you will. What I want to say tonight is only this. I was a man with nothing to say to anyone for 7 years, and you gave me words back. Not by demanding them or drawing them out, but just by being the kind of person that words want to go to. I am grateful for every letter and every morning and every supper, and every one of those 4 sleeping people in the next 2 rooms. I am grateful for Francis the horse and the Dusty Rose Saloon and Gerald Morse's unhelpful disposition, and the fact that your brother went east to the wrong place and brought you to Caldwell. I am grateful for a laugh I heard across a room and could not ignore. Thank you for being findable. All my love, Matthew." He folded it and set it on the table under the handle of the coffee cup, so it would be the first thing she found when she came into the kitchen in the morning. Then he closed the journal, extinguished the lamp, and went to bed in the November dark of the Kansas plains, in the house he had built with his own hands, beside the woman who had given him back the ability to say true things to another living person. And he slept deeply and completely, the sleep of a man whose life was exactly where it was supposed to be. In the morning, as he was pulling on his boots in the early dark before the children were up, he heard her reading it in the kitchen. He could not hear the words, but he could hear the stillness, the particular quality of a person standing at a table reading something that matters. And then he heard her set the kettle on the stove. And a moment later she appeared in the bedroom doorway in her dressing gown with her hair down and her eyes bright in a way that was not quite tears, and was something better than tears. And she held the note in one hand. "Matthew Watkins," she said. "Good morning," he said. She crossed the room and kissed him with her coffee-making hands on either side of his face, and it was the kind of kiss that made no concession to the early hour or the fact that he still had one boot on and the other in his hand. And when she pulled back, she was smiling with the whole smile, the impatient corner and everything after. "Every single day," she said, which was not quite a full sentence but which he understood perfectly. "Every single day," he agreed. He finished pulling on his boots and went out to the barn to start the morning work, and the Chikaskia River country was black and silver in the pre-dawn, and the stars were still up over Kansas, and a horse in the field blew a cloud of steam in the cold air, and somewhere east in the cottonwoods along the creek, a bird made a single sound too early for meadowlarks, the wrong bird. But it was alive and present in the darkness, and Matthew heard it and noted it, the way he noted all small true things now. Carefully and with gratitude, the way a man notes things when he has learned that they will not always be there, and has also learned, against the expectation of his younger self, that there is always more ahead, that the good things do not run out, that a life given to a particular piece of ground and a particular person, and the words that run between them grows only fuller with the years, and the words keep coming, and the pen is never again put down.